Okay, I'm gonna do it. Why, oh, why I'm gonna do it, I don't know, but I'm gonna do it. So it's a year on, and Biden has been in office, and he has done his job. He has done exactly what he was put into office to do, and that is to keep the country from burning down. That's legit. Um, One of the things I like so much about Joe Rogan is that he has this way of getting people to just kind of talk to him and say things that probably they wouldn't say in other interviews and make people comfortable. I considered being a counselor for a good number of years and then a personal coach because I have kind of a similar trait. In fact, and I know what mine comes from. It comes from growing up far too fast, listening to adult problems as a child. But I have this way of sitting there and listening to people, and whether I'm judging what they're saying or not as being moral or immoral, like I could have probably interviewed Hitler. You have to be able to put all that stuff away when you're dealing with people, especially if you're trying to deal with them in a situation where you're trying to help them. But there is this ability to kind of do that, and then people will tell you all sorts of stuff. All sorts. You know, for me, I've had people that were almost complete strangers sit there and I'd talk to them for a while and they'd eventually start crying. Not even just talking, but just listening. I met my best friend in California, coincidentally a African American girl at the time. At CSUN, we sat there and she talked to me for like 10 minutes and she just started crying because I was the first person she'd been able to talk to and be real with for who knows how long. That is a very special skill set. It is a gift. It can also be a curse. But I've had all sorts told of me. I've had things admitted to me I'd rather never have known. Things that cost me the loss of much sleep. But in having that trait, especially there was a time when I had a lot of black friends in America, and I heard the stuff that other people, especially in the white community in America, don't hear. And so I've known the kind of anger, which is kind of one of the reasons I've stayed out of the country as much as I have since the whole racism bomb got detonated next to me, because I know the kind of hurt and anger and resentment and all of those things that is still there, that I think a lot of people hoped that the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King had all dealt with, and now we moved on and we're in the present. Well, yeah, you can say that, but it's still real recent history, and there's still plenty of people alive who remember plenty of stuff and don't think they don't pass those stories down. Things that, especially with me being mixed race, I think that a lot of people kind of have seen me as maybe not only some potential for hope, but as along with this ability I have to kind of sit there and listen and hear what people are saying, and on occasion I will try and do the therapist thing and feed it back to them in some kind of CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy way that will help them maybe see it from a different perspective and heal a bit or whatever. But on those skill sets my position racially and in that skill set of being able to sit there and listen and hear those things has led me to hear and bring out, whether I wanted to or not, within certain people I've talked to who are members of the African American community, some very difficult and real and visceral emotions. In 2020, naming the George Floyd situation was a friendly, not so friendly reminder of exactly what I'd been saying and experiencing myself every time I went back to the U.S. Whatever you may think about Donald Trump, he has a very incendiary style. I have listened to some of his interviews recently. He seems to have toned that down significantly. That's a good thing. I think there were some people who just thought you could meet all of this kind of leftist intersectional extremism that's coming up as a response to the history and all of that with just stalwart equal opposition. And all that was going to be ever was two massive forces colliding, which is personified in the policing style that met George Floyd and the behavior that George Floyd himself exhibited and the resistance to authority and the lack of compliance. It's almost, that situation is almost a metaphor for the experience on a larger scale. I can remember the Rodney King situation. I remember very much sitting there from Tennessee at my friend's house watching LA burn. These are not new emotions. These are not new feelings. This is not a new situation. And I think there are forces within the U.S. that have been trying to kind of make this a controlled detonation. And part of trying to make this seem like anything besides racial tension coming to the surface has led to things like intersectionality and trying to pretend that the obstacles that people who are overweight face are the same exact obstacles that people that are black face, that are the same exact obstacles that people that are disabled face, trying to pretend all these things are all the same thing and that it's all prejudice. Well, it's not all the same thing. You're born black, you're black. You're born whatever, and you end up overweight. You can go on a diet. I've heard this said many times. Being bisexual, I've had discussions with friends of mine who are black, who are ardently anti-homosexual, highly religious, who are against gay whatever. And the argument is always, well, you can hide being gay. You can't hide being black. And my argument was always, well, why should you have to hide being gay? Why should the fact that it's an option mean that it can be foisted upon you as a necessary reality? So, back when you could have these discussions and not have your life destroyed. But I'm saying all of this to say that, I think that had it been Trump elect versus a houseplant, the houseplant would have ended up in office, because whatever you want to think about how that election went down, whatever you want to think about the outcome, the idea of things being as tense as they were with 2020 and with the stresses that COVID put on the population and everything else, to have Donald Trump, without him changing his style, without him having kind of a epiphany of his own that led him to mitigate some of the kind of barnstorming, tough guy rhetoric. And not to say that Joe Biden doesn't have that too. I remember him talking about going out and beating somebody up behind the gym or something. I mean, this is just not helpful rhetoric style, folks. It's just not. Given the amount of kindling and dry kindling sitting around, lighting these kinds of matches and taking these kinds of tones is not going to be helpful. And, I've told the story before. I can remember sitting in a chapel at a rescue mission I was having to stay at in Nashville. And there were maybe 30, 40 people in the room, 20 of them probably white, and I was talking to one black woman. In my usual style, I'm sitting there and I'm listening, and she's telling me things she would never usually say out loud. And she starts yelling, and literally yells this so that every white person in the place turns around, and she says, "I'd kill every cracker in here because a white man raped my grandmother." And she had to be 40 herself. So these stories, these realities from, 50, 60, 70 years ago? There were people there that breathed that air and walked on that dust and, saw those bodies hanging and go watch XXXTentacion, look at me. There are powerful cultural engineering entities in the U.S. who understand this stuff, who understand what they've been sitting on. Go back and do some research on Charlie Manson and the kind of powers he had keeping him out of trouble. And be aware that one of his biggest things he was ever preaching about was race wars coming for the U.S. And so I think there's been a lot of song and dance, especially when you start looking at intersectionality, and if you try to pick it apart rationally and reasonably and realize a lot of it just makes no sense. These quote-unquote alliances, there's been a lot of attempt to make things seem like anything but what they are. And one of the reasons I don't wade into this as much as I used to anymore is because I understand, especially after watching those George Floyd riots and seeing how much social media and algorithms that reinforce our beliefs and keep us on the pages reinforce these ideas of how we're right and make us more maybe arrogant and more even quick to jump to violence as a solution because we believe we're so right. We're constantly reassured and reaffirmed about being so right. To see all of these elements coming together and mixing up, it's not surprising that it ends in violence on the streets, and it's not surprising that it could lead to more. But Joe Biden, just by not being Donald Trump and having a somewhat catering to the people that were the squeakiest wheel, catering to the side that has the most likely to kick off over grievances, most likelihood to kick off over grievances, just by being that guy, he's done his job. Just by keeping everything from kicking off to the point that it could really at any given moment. He's done his job. And, when you start realizing that, and this is what me, Ben Shapiro, everybody has to come to the realization of, facts are great, statistics are great, understanding probabilities is terrific. But when you've got a bunch of angry people that feel a certain kind of way, facts don't pull triggers. Facts don't burn and loot and riot and do whatever. Feelings do that. And people do that. And people who feel some kind of way can act some kind of way. So, that's my statement on 1 year of, everyone's on some level apparently not pleased with Joe Biden's performance, and I would say that he was there to be vanilla ice cream, as unoffensive as possible to everyone, outside of maybe people on the extreme right who would be problematic to enough people for it not to matter if they were offended, because they're so fringe that they don't have any numbers. I mean, nobody's really out there. I would be shocked to know that there are still KKK rallies going on anywhere. I know like 10, 15 years ago that was still a thing. Like some places like Pulaski, Tennessee, but Dothan, Alabama, real rural places but even there now, I mean, I've lived in the country, and this is how I know it's not as bad as a lot of people think. Like, I've lived out in the country, and there aren't that many real hardcore racist folks. There just aren't, not even in the strongholds of the ex-slavery South. And I've lived in the buckle of the Bible Belt. And there's just not that many truly die-hard, ready to pick up a gun and try to kill anybody. That stuff is taught, and that's stuff that's been taught out of most of the population within America over the last 50 years. It takes one generation. So, and then that generation raises their kids, and on it goes. So, but to the people who are still raising grandchildren out there that can remember the horrors, they're telling those stories, and they have a right to. And there's a lot of suffering that's happened, and there needs to be some way for that to be heard and healed. Usually that would be a counseling or therapy situation on a personal level. And like I said, from personally hearing those stories and personally experiencing the blowback from being perceived as racist, even though I'm half black myself, I know how much anger is still there. So some of that, I hate to say it, but when you've got somebody who's 70, 75 years old and who was forced to drink from separate colored water fountains, if you want to see the reality of all this, look at South Africa, look at the blowback, look at what's going on with, the white minority now, look at the taking of lands, the taking of white farms, the redistribution of lands, look at, Zimbabwe, look at some of the horrible retributions that have been exacted upon white South African farmers and families, to the point that a lot of them have fled to New Zealand. So, and other places, the anger is real, and it's not justified, and I understand, okay, well, the history affects the present, but when you're talking about dealing with 20, 25, 30-year-old, 40-year-old white people, I mean, and even if they had nothing to do with it, and even the people who grew up during the actual real racism, they were born into what they were born into, whatever color water fountain you drink from. If you were born white, you drank from the white water fountain. So, I would say that Joe Biden is not the worst thing to have happened. I don't really know what else to say about all of that, but I know that I never want to see 2020 again, or anything like it. And it would be really nice if people could start acting more like individuals and start really working on healing themselves as individuals, as opposed to simply adopting group identity and kind of transferring their own personal anger and rage onto group problems, because that's easier to pretend is the issue. If you grew up in a dysfunctional family and you don't want to admit certain things to yourself about maybe your parents weren't the healthiest, maybe your community wasn't the healthiest, the neighborhood you grew up in, it's very easy to try and externalize that and say, well, it's because of this thing, this systemic thing over here, as opposed to the fact that I just grew up around flawed humans. And it's led me to have some dysfunction in my life. That's a hard thing to look at in yourself and admit. I've had to do it before. All the issues I had learned with, the ways I learned to eat, the dysfunctional ways I learned how to handle money growing up, all that came from being in a household that was dysfunctional in those areas. We didn't treat money well. We didn't know how to treat money. Well, I can't say that, but I wasn't raised to treat money well. I came from a household that was dysfunctional in that way. I didn't grow up to understand food because I grew up in a house that abused food. Substance abuse in my family was an issue. So these things went on to become issues in my own life. That is much more powerful and influence in your existence than anything you're going to get out of the Oval Office or anything that's going to happen to you because of systemic historical injustices. And it's harder stuff to admit. It's hard because it's much more intimate. It's much more having to look in the mirror and be honest. But the work you can do and the improvements you can make from looking in the mirror and being honest about what you see, those improvements will improve your quality of life exponentially more than any kind of change out here you try to enforce in the system. Because honestly, at this point, folks, the law has done just about all it can do to make everything equal. Trying to force things extra in the other direction. I can remember thinking, even when I was younger, about affirmative action and being like, well, that sounds like prejudice in the opposite direction. Just trying to launch prejudice in the opposite direction to even things up, it's not going to work. It's not going to work to change a system when the problems aren't in the system anymore. So that's my spiel about all of that. Personal improvement. It really is the key to so much. Not recently, I wanted to fight Muay Thai forever. I wanted to train Muay Thai forever at least. And it's led me to watching UFC that and watching a couple episodes of Joe Rogan where he was talking about UFC stuff. And there's these fighters coming up now, this fight that's about to happen, this guy Francis Ngannou, he comes from Cameroon, and he openly talks about the struggles and the poverty and what he's faced and how it's motivated him to use the skill set that he has and the talents that he has. So do you think instead of going in and training every day and focusing on diet and focusing on mental preparedness to fight, do you think had he been out, I don't know, picketing the White House or marching down the Champs-Élysées to try and create change or whatever, had he done those things instead of focusing on his time in the gym, do you think he'd be getting to where he is today and the level of success he has in his sport? I mean, there's nobody stopping people of color from working in France. There's nobody stopping people of color from working in anywhere in the West anymore. So now that the laws have been addressed, the real work is to take advantage, to get the skill set and the mindset to take advantage of the opportunities that are there. And you can see that in immigrants who come over and they take advantage of opportunities that exist here in the West, and their kids go on to thrive and do amazing things, and they build lives and prosper. So go and do likewise, and don't throw the baby out with the bathwater when it comes to the things that do exist here that are good in the West. And believe me, there's plenty of problems, but those problems have very little to do with identity politics at this point. That stuff's been dealt with. Now we're facing the collapse of freedom in very serious terms. In transitions in global status and all the rest of that, but that's a different topic. But I just wanted to say, take it easy on each other, less incendiary and more empathetic and compassionate listening can be helpful. It can also bring out some stuff you didn't want to hear, or was trying to hope you could pretend wasn't there, but it's better to know about it and deal with it and find ways to get other people to help themselves and start thinking up solutions for the problem. If you refuse to even admit the problem exists, first step in AA. One of the first couple steps, I can't remember. Anyway, whatever. Okay. But yeah, carpe diem. And don't pick on Joe Biden, because he's doing what he was put in office to do, which is basically hold down a chair and just not let the country burn. That's it. That was like the whole mandate, really. It was, please God, don't let the country burn down. Okay.